humor is the essence of common sense.
Mm-hmm. There's a great quote from Clive James in your book.
Clive James, the Australian English poet and critic, said that that a sense of humor is just common sense operating at a different speed. A sense of humor is just common sense dancing. Absolutely right. And he goes on to say, people who lack a sense of humor have no sense, no common sense, and shouldn't be trusted with anything. Don't give someone who hasn't got a sense of humor a letter to post. Always help them across the road. I mean, it is a real disability. It's like a kind of emotional, psychological dyslexia, complete. They should have one of those initial things in America, like obsessive compulsive disorder, and no humor disorder.
To the Harbor Grace excursion with the most to have.
Books really saved my life.
In 1989, I was given a book called London Fields, and when I started to read it, I couldn't believe. I was astonished by how consistently malevolent it seemed, but at the same time, hilariously funny. And then I was given an opportunity to meet the author. Martin Amis consented to do an interview on my radio program, Brave New Waves, a show that I describe as nasty, brutish, and long. And after the interview, I was feeling cheeky, and I said to him, Martin Amis, have a nice millennium. And we turned the mic off, and he went. And then he took my copy of London Fields, and he inscribed it, and he said, Brent, have a nicer millennium. So please welcome to the stage the author of 14 novels, a terrific memoir, a number of works of nonfiction, including his latest compilation, The Rub of Time, and a man referred to by some in Las Vegas as Martin effing Amis. So, The Rub of Time, it sounds delicious. It sounds like something you would do to a lamb shank.
Oh, I see, T-H-Y-M-E.
I know you don't like puns, it's not your thing.
No, I don't like puns. They're described by Fowler, the author of Modern Usage, as the lowest, it's usually described as the lowest form of wit. And Fowler said, this is too simple. There are good puns and there are bad puns, and we should sort of grow up about puns. He was wrong about that. All puns are terrible. The only one I thought was quite good in my life that I've ever heard was describing the Iran-Iraq war, where the title of a piece was Between Iraq and a Hard Place. I thought that wasn't bad. But only essentially frivolous people use puns.
But wait, what about your friend Christopher Hitchens? He loved puns.
I know, well, that was his great weakness. All puns do is make words look stupid. They achieve nothing more than that. It's very nice to be here in Toronto. It's, for an Englishman, it's like being back in England on a continent. It's a bit of America in that it's continental in scale and just as dramatic in its landscapes, but it feels, the civilizational level is much closer to England, maybe even higher than England. And it also feels post-racial, as England dramatically does if you've been living in America. Go back to England and you think, what's different about the mental atmosphere? And it's that somehow that isn't part of it, the racial awareness. Also, you have a wonderful health service, which, like England, what they call single payer. The Americans call it a single payer system. How they arrived at that, I don't know. But not too long ago, in 2015, I spent a couple of nights in an American hospital. My first sleepover in a hospital since I had my tonsils out. And you go in and you get all the usual checks, and I had a nasty fall. It was one of my Rob Ford evenings. And you have the medical stuff, then you check into this sort of sanitized or sterilized guest house on the top floors. And spent 2 nights there, and then I checked out of this hotel, and I thought not a bad hotel, sort of 3-4-star hotel, rather over-attentive staff, you know, coming in at 5 in the morning to do your blood pressure and that kind of thing, and putting you in a kind of kitchen drawer and closing it so they could do MRIs and CAT scans and that kind of thing. I didn't pay the bill as I left, but when the bill came, I did wonder at the expense. I thought, did it live up to it, how much it cost? Was it value for money? I mean, you can spend a night, I gather, at the Plaza, swinishly luxurious plaza, for $800. The Pierre is a snip at $500 or $600. The hospital I was in, a rather higher rate, it was $27,000. And whatever civilization consists of, a for-profit healthcare system is not one of those elements. So I feel a little safer in Canada than I do in America.
Well, you interviewed John Updike when he was in the hospital having a minor procedure performed. And I wonder how that interview came about. Did you call him for an interview and say, I'd like to speak to you? And he said, oh, good, I'm having a precancerous wart taken off of my hand. Why don't you come and talk to me while I'm wearing a hospital gown?
Well, that's what he was there for, although the little procedure was delayed. So we did have a 1.5, 2-hour interview in the cafeteria at Massachusetts General, and which is a vast, I don't know about, the hospital must be pretty big because the cafeteria was enormous. Mm-hmm. I had a smoking section too, which I used. I guess the smoking section was good for business. And I was young. I was sort of 33, 34. I just had my first son, and we talked a lot about that. But I couldn't contain it. I said, this is a disgusting sight for an Englishman. This huge mall devoted to health, with people strolling around looking for bargains on longevity. And I really meant the whole system, which I do think is not only iniquitous, but titanically stupid and wasteful. And Americans spend a huge fraction of GNP on the healthcare system, twice what England spends and what Scandinavia spends in general. And he was very sharp about that. He said, oh, but anything like that would be very un-American. And he went on, he said, eloquent as always, although being rather like Rabbit Angstrom, the sort of hick, lunk hero of that tetralogy of his, Rabbit is Rich, Rabbit Run, etc. He said that to take away your discretionary powers at such a crucial moment in your life would be un-American. And I thought, I wondered what he meant, and it occurred to me few days later that your pocketbook, your income should decide everything about your life right up until your last breath. And if you're rich, you should get better care than if you're poor. And everything in me rejects that. But that is the American way. And the way the Republicans are talking at the moment, Paul Ryan, he said, you know, Medicaid and Medicare, you know, that's always been the problem fiscally. Now translate that. What does that mean? That means any kind of assistance to the individual from the state is anathema to an American. Well satirized by, I think, Tom Friedman in the Times when he said, George W. Bush said, he said, this money we collect from you for revenue, it's not the government's money, it's your money. And when Katrina happened, Trump said that Bush was effectively, Hurricane Katrina, Bush was effectively saying, it's not the government's hurricane, it's your hurricane. And that's why the main American principle I've come to believe is that they don't want a single cent of their money spent on someone else. That's why they like charity. Romney says it should all be charity, not taxation, so that someone like him can go around looking like Cicero or Voltaire and watching the effects of his generosity and getting the gratitude of that.
And the tax breaks.
And the tax breaks, so it all works beautifully. And really, I think at the heart of it is a hatred of the poor, which is very American, fear and hatred of the poor. And it reminds me of what Dickens wrote in Oliver Twist, where Bumble the Beetle, just in 3 words sums it up. He says, them vicious paupers, those vicious paupers. That if you're poor, it's because it's a moral failing. And in America, there's that other layer of it, which is, with healthcare, I don't want to spend a cent on some lowlife who has got himself in hospital because he drinks too much or smokes too much. That I want to divest myself from that, while at the same time sort of hankering with a strange nostalgia for those weaknesses that got him in there. And Puritanism is really still deeply present in all the legislation in America.
But you've lauded America, though, as a place that's welcomed you. You've lived there now for a number of years. With the immigration debate that we're seeing now and the kind of language around that debate, do you think that America will continue to be a place that is open to immigration and to the idea of immigration?
Well, I worry because immigration took quite a battering under Obama, who did more deporting than George W. Bush.
That's true.
The whole idea looks rather fragile to me now, although America is definingly an immigrant society. That's what makes it great. But Trump is a capsizer. I mean, he has flipped the lifeboat entirely, but it was already looking a bit weak. So this noble tradition, Statue of Liberty, bring me your poor. Bring me your poor from shithole countries. You're not going to hear anything like that from Trump.
What would Kingsley Amis make of Trump's use of language?
It would be an adventure playground for him to look at transcripts of Trump's speeches. I think he would have concentrated on bigly. Because there's a chapter in my father's book, a posthumous book about usage, where he says everyone thinks that if an adverb doesn't have an ly on it, you've got to add one. And I have a dentist in New York who says, I couldn't believe it the first time he said it. He said, open widely. I said, what? And then he smiled and said, open big. And I had the great Jessica Lange at an award ceremony in Los Angeles thanking various often overlooked figures in her support team and saying, and lastly, but not leastly. And Kingsley said, what nextly? And I've had, fully well. Well, full well used to do. And he said it's one of those illiteracies that's done in the name, not of literacy, but of consistency. That if it's an adverb, it has an ly at the end of it. Kellyanne Conway exhaustingly put it about that he doesn't say bigly. And in fact, he stopped saying that phrase that sounds like bigly. That what he's actually saying is big league. Yes. Big hyphenated League. Unknown in the lexicographer's database, but that's what he's apparently saying. The economy's going to boom. I mean, big league. But and maybe that is what he's saying, but it's not much of an improvement on big league.
There's an introduction, a new introduction to this book by Kingsley Amis, called delightfully The King's English, in The Rub of Time, and in it you reveal that Kingsley Amis was critical of your own writing and your use of language when you began to be published. What did you make of that?
Well, as I say, he was a sort of absentee father, or a minimalist father. He was always nice and always gentle, and when you did pass him on the stairs as he was slipping into his study, he would always say something that made you laugh, and nearly always because of the way he put it, and that went a long way. I never felt at all starved of his affection, but he didn't really engage me until I started reading books for grown-ups, which I did rather late, I have to say, sort of 17, 18. And then it turned into not only a very good relationship, father-son, but a good literary friendship. Mm-hmm. And Christopher Hitchens said he'd never seen a father and son get on as easily as I did with my father. But he did reproach me with some asperity and malice if ever I made a grammatical mistake in book reviews, which I started off with in my early 20s. And he'd say at breakfast, because I still used to go and spend every other weekend in his house, he said, you know about your enormity in the Observer, do you? And I thought, oh, well, Christ, what's this? And I knew enormity meant something very bad and not something very big. And there were a couple of really bad ones. I mean, I used martial, M-A-R-T-I-A-L, as a verb. Mm-hmm. Not very good. And I've never forgotten this. He reproached me. I'm pretty sure that maybe half of you use this word in this sense, which is it's become the meaning of the word, which is you can't stop usage. No power on earth can reverse a change that's made in the language. I mean, people who used to say, they don't say it anymore, but there were old curmudgeons who used to say, I reject the use of the word gay for homosexual, and demand it back for heterosexual use. It's not going to work. But I described some critic's attack on another critic as his infamous crucifixion of so-and-so. And Kingsley said, you leave no doubt of what you thought of it, meaning that I was saying it was a infamous used to mean evil, abominable. Now it just means, notorious, or not even that, it just means famous now. The England manager with his infamous umbrella, because he stood under it during a downpour, which was considered a bit wimpy. It's amazing to watch this sort of thing happening, where it looks like a fancy addition to the language, infamous meaning notorious, of ill fame. But in fact, it's a subtraction to the language for anyone who cares about words, because I would never, you can't use it through ambiguity. Same goes for decimate, which used to mean, it was a punishment in the Roman army, that you killed 1 man in 10. Now you read people saying he totally decimated the ranks. It means more like 9 out of 10.
Nearly obliterated.
And it's a loss to the language. It's not an addition. The best example he gives is Deja Vu, which you ask anyone what that means, and it says it's something that's happened before. And politicians use it all, and journalists use it all the time. It is with a distinct sense of deja vu that one listens to so-and-so's excuses about meaning we've heard it before. But deja vu means, funnily enough, it means it describes something that you haven't experienced before. And what it describes is that funny, romantic, wistful, youthful feeling, very much connected with, for instance, first love, where you see someone and you have a sense of deja vu. And what it means is you think you've seen them before, whereas you provably haven't seen them before. Or you go to a place that feels resonant in a strange way. And it's a little bit of romantic displacement in your mind, where suddenly everything seems charged and significant, and it feels like you've seen it before. But in fact, that's the point, is that you haven't seen it before.
But you make the point that there's no way to bring these words back into proper usage, that once this has happened, the people who are arguing for them to return to proper usage it's a lost cause.
Oh, waste of breath.
Yeah.
And that's how it should be. That's how language evolves. And if those people who want the word gay back for heterosexual use had their way, the language would die of purity, like medieval Latin. Unlike ancient Latin or classical Latin, which died of impurity. You've got to hold on to the meanings of words for as long as you can, and then cease to use them when they become ambiguous. It's only a small fraction of the population cares about it, and only quite a small fraction of writers care about this sort of thing. But I think it's, I certainly care about it, probably just out of filial obedience to my father. But it's a way of distinguishing a writer who's careful and a writer who doesn't really bother that much.
There is some exceptionally deep literary criticism in this collection, and I want to talk about that in a moment. But before we do that, I just want to come back to Hitchens for this one question. And this is a quote from the book, and I wonder if you could complete the sentence for me. If Christopher Hitchens were alive today, you wrote in 2017.
What would he make of the following? You mean,
what would he make of where we are as opposed to where we were when he left?
well, that's always a moot question when the Hitch is involved, because he's taken up some shocking positions.
Yes.
He was not only pro the Iraq War, there's plenty can be said about that, but he was pro Bush Cheney in 2004.
And he hated the Clintons.
Hated the Clintons with an irrational energy. He was for Ralph Nader in the election of 2000. That, you know, without Nader, the independent candidate, Al Gore would have won quite comfortably.
But you don't imagine that he would be pro-Trump.
Well, he wouldn't have been pro-Clinton, pro-Hillary Clinton. But I think once the cat was out of the bag and Trump had won, I think all that would have fallen away, and he would now, if he were alive, be certainly the main intellectual voice of the resistance to Trump. And he would be, as it were, the ideological soulmate of Bernie Sanders. Because he was always on the left. And I'll tell you what his last words were in a minute. And funnily enough, his passion for the Iraq War, because he didn't just write one piece saying, let's go in. He went on the road for that war. He had lunches with Paul Wolfowitz. He proselytized for that war. And I couldn't understand it. And I was, you know, firmly of the other camp and just wrote one long piece about it. But he was such a hater of Saddam, and he saw a brutal dictatorship, and from the left he wanted to take it down. And I always thought, as I said in the piece, that you can't introduce democracy to a nation that has never known any truth, any openness, any free exchange of views, no free press ever in its history, in a region of the world where democracy has only existed since the formation of Israel, that it was utopian. And he was, I think, a prey to utopian thinking. And his last words were, people used to stop him in the street when I was strolling around with him and say, "Are you a neocon?" And I always thought that was rubbish. I mean, he was an old street-fighting lefty right to the end. And his last words, which I didn't hear, but were reported to me by his son, Alexander, and I arrived a day later, and he was unconscious by then. But his last two words were, "Capitalism, downfall." He was a Trotskyist. He used to say, he said, "No, don't call me a Trotskyite." And I said, "What should I call you?" And he said, "Trotskyist." And I said, "Okay." And he said, "Only a Stalinist would call me a Trotskyite." So I had to get the distinctions, you know, Right, and he never gave up Trotsky. He was, I mean, he's a romantic politically. And that's, I'm sure that's why he was so widely loved, because of this romanticism, and because he was very unpredictable, and because also he suffered for his political views. He suffered horribly when the Iraq War began to go wrong. He wrote a ridiculous piece after the initial campaign was over and George Bush appeared under that sign saying "Mission Accomplished," which now looks, ridiculously hubristic. But when it started to go wrong, he was really churned up for years. And he wrote a piece that began, "Nani, nani, na, na," which was a taunt to all the people who had resisted the war. You can't do that. But later on in his autobiography, Hitch 22, he said the way the pro-war journalists accepted the propaganda about weapons of mass destruction will permanently disfigure their record. And he fessed up to that extent, although he'd never been known to say he was wrong about anything.
The Rub of Time is a collection of, as I said before, criticism and journalism. And when you were editing it for this collection, what did you learn about predictive writing or the dangers of predictive writing?
Well, I'd always been skeptical about, it's not a literary art to predict the future. Predictive power is impressive when you come across it, but, and there have been some very lucky hits, particularly, and not to be dismissed, by J.G. Ballard, who predicted global warming in the 60s, and Don DeLillo, who once described in the 80s the World Trade Center as being made out of light, which was exactly its fate after it was destroyed. For a couple of years, it just was a light show, wasn't it? Really striking. And DeLillo, in addition, had a great ear and feel for the rhythms of the future. But it's a bit hokey and carny and there's something about the nature of world events. Philip Roth described it as the remorseless unforeseen. And that's good. That is what world events are. They constantly dismay you with how no one has predicted them. Like Trump, like Brexit. No one predicted that kind of development. And it seems it's in the nature of history, particularly the accelerated history that we're living under now. When did it happen that history started to speed up? But it has happened. And that has affected everything. It's certainly affected the novel. It's affected poetry in that, what poetry does is stop the clock. It says, lyric poetry stops the clock and says, right, we're going to spend a few minutes at least examining this epiphany and seeing what it means and what it suggests. And we don't want to stop the clock. Emotionally, we're committed to the clock speeding up. And the novel, very noticeably, has speeded up. And that's as it should be. It's not a bandwagon. It's, novelists are citizens in this accelerated world, and they naturally adapted to this increased pace. And I noticed it happening in the 1990s, where I thought the forward momentum of whatever I was writing had to speed up. It was just a instinctive urge, but later one can rationalize these things and say, because everything else is speeding up.
So how did that manifest? Are you talking about the rate of the prose, the rate of the action?
What next has to happen sooner than it might have done in a 900-page Victorian novel, or what they call a baggy monster, big, digressive novel. That all those things are dead now, really. Similarly, the deductive novel, that Nabokov is not a bad example of, where the reader is really expected to be very alert and to pick up clues, and things that are not stated have to be inferred or surmised. That is really dead now, and unless you state something clear and simple. I wrote a novel where a very important character was black, but I didn't want to actually say that, and I thought her name, her history would surely do that job for me, but absolutely no one got it. And in the paperback, I put in a remark where saying, the whole novel is addressed to her, and the narrator says, you understand this because you're black, you see. And I had to really spell it out with some bitterness, because no one, including all my closest readers, my editor, my agent, everyone, no one got it. And I thought, that's really dead. You've got to state it. And what's dead above all, and good riddance, is anything like the stream of consciousness.
Burroughs.
Well, I was thinking more Joyce. Burroughs, yeah, I mean, up to a point, but Burroughs was always a sort of marginal figure of great talent, but Joyce is the icon of stream of consciousness. Virginia Woolf. But now all that's unbearable to read. John Updike did a fair amount of stream of consciousness, couples. You're assuming, as you set pen to paper on page one, you're saying, I'm a genius. And you'll have to trust me that this makes sense and will be rewarding. But I'm not going to make any allowances for your usual expectations. You have to I'm a genius. Now, I think the novel is a very social form, a sociable form, and that perhaps explains why 90% of all fiction has always been social realism, and 99.9% of all fiction that's remembered and valued and has endured is social realism. And there must be a lesson in that. It must be that you as a writer, you're the host and your reader is the guest. And those two words have the same root. They used to mean the same thing. And that too is noticeable, because reading and writing are almost the same thing in all sorts of ways. So you have a sort of code of conduct. You don't introduce 15 characters on page one. You don't crowd take a very welcoming writer like Nabokov, and go along with the guest host idea. You show up on page one of a Nabokov novel. He welcomes you in, gives you plenty to think about immediately, gives you the best, most comfortable armchair nearest the fire, serves his best wine, and addresses you stretched to his very best, making an enormous effort to make you feel comfortable. And you go and see James Joyce, and you've got the address that you've been given, and very difficult to find. It's where it's 86 so-and-so street, and you get to 85, and then there's nothing there. But you do find it eventually around the corner, and then you ring the bell, no answer. Then you wander around this strange building in the dark with various little booby traps all over the place. And you call his name, and eventually you find him in some kitchen on the 9th floor. And he turns around and addresses you in a language you've never heard before. And whereas Nabokov serves a delicious stew and with very nice wine, Joyce gives you 2 slabs of peat around a conger eel and some filthy concoction that is just, because he doesn't care about you. And I'm more and more convinced that I've been saying for years, you've got to love the reader. And Joyce, apart from Dubliners, his first book of stories, where he shows some concern for the reader, he never gave a shit about the reader at all. And that is, it's not so bad if you're not writing social realism, but it sort of disqualifies you from that, the sociable aspect of what fiction is.
I'm enjoying listening to you talk about the novel. There is only one essay in this book about the novel, but it's a very interesting one because it's about your novel. I should say there's only one essay about your novels in this book. It is about Time Zero, which I think is a fascinating book. And you tell the story of how the book came to be, Time Zero, and you describe a sense of panic before you began. So what was the sense of panic? What was the root of that?
It was a novel about the Holocaust. And it was your, can you dare to go there, to this area where many intellectuals have said the novelist must not intrude, it has no business in describing this terminal point in humanity.
No poetry after Auschwitz.
Exactly. But there was poetry during Auschwitz. There was Paul Salon and many others, and Primo Levi, who was a poet as well as a novelist. And I thought there's something fraudulent about this line. So I said that I thought, since fiction is freedom by definition, that can't be right. And why should one subject hive itself off and say, this is something you can't go near? And it always seemed just philosophically suspect to me. And then you build up the courage to do it, or the nerve, or the folly. You feel brave and stupid, and you do it. And you find that it's just as amenable to fiction. Mm-hmm. I mean, fiction is powerful, and fiction is an enormous power. And look what it's done. There's nothing it can't do. Mm-hmm. So I pressed ahead. What was much riskier, and it is a real flaw of that novel, is that there are some cheap jokes because the novel is conceived in a backwards in time universe for reasons that I think do add up. And it's narrated by a doctor, a Nazi doctor. And that adds up too, because the Nazi vision was a biomedical vision. Mm. It was to cut out the cancer of Jewry and make Germany whole. But then I wrote a second novel about the Holocaust, much more recently, 2013. And that too has quite a lot of comedy in it. And I justify that particular part of that novel in that, don't tell me that the Nazi project wasn't ridiculous. It had much that was completely laughable about it and utterly self-defeating. If those trains hadn't been transporting Jews to the eastern border in Poland, it's very doubtful whether the West would have won that war. It distorted it was insane. And insanity is a very difficult subject in fiction, and inimical to fiction because it's so incoherent. Insanity is incoherent above all, that I sort of stuck with that. And the overall justification for writing about the Holocaust is that it's to make sure it never happens again. It's just one more nail in the historical coffin of that kind of project. And if any politician now whispered anything about eugenics, about racial purity, although we're hovering on the brink of that in America at the moment, but that would set off so many alarm bells that they couldn't proceed. And what I went around Germany a bit with this novel, the German translation, and I admire the Germans very much for all the work they've done to purge their history of this great shame, this disgrace, which is what it is, and crime. And although in France, where they've made no effort at all to speak of, that's not fair, but they have not made the concerted effort that Germany has made by teaching it in schools and so on. You don't hear much about it in France. They certainly don't teach it. And Mitterrand, as recently as Mitterrand, saying, I will never apologize for La France. And their history is nothing like as shameful as Germany, but it's very shameful. But the book was welcomed in France, but in Germany, a very crude separation was review after review saying you cannot have a serious novel about a serious subject that uses humor. Now, I think that's a barbaric rule, incredibly crude rule, that as if humor is something trivial that goes on, behind your head. It's not. Humor is the essence of common sense.
There's a great quote from Clive James in your book.
Clive James, the Australian English poet and critic, said that a sense of humor is just common sense operating at a different speed. A sense of humor is just common sense dancing. Absolutely right. And he goes on to say, people who lack a sense of humor have no common sense and shouldn't be trusted with anything. Don't give someone who hasn't got a sense of humor a letter to post. Always help them across the road. I mean, it is a real disability. It's like a kind of emotional, psychological dyslexia, complete. They should have one of those initial things in America, like obsessive compulsive disorder, no humor disorder.
We're going to take questions in just a moment. I have one or two quick questions to ask you. One, writing again about Updike, you said, my impression is that writers, as they age, lose energy but gain in craft. Is that true of you?
Yeah, pretty much. I think I used to divide it that all writers have an element of genius and an element of talent. Genius is the sort of God-given altitude of perception and euphony. And talent is just organizational. It's technique. It's knowing where to put things, how to modulate things, when to release a certain piece of information, timing, variation of scene, you know, that kind of thing. That's all talent, and that gets better as you get older. Genius weakens. And you know, your allotment of talent and genius, I think every writer who's got a body of work has got some genius. But it can distort you. I mean, the thriller writer has probably got a lot of talent and not much genius. James Joyce, I'm sorry to seem to have it in for him, but he had a lot of genius and no talent whatever. And I was in an essay on Nabokov that I formulated this. But everyone knows that Nabokov had a lot of genius, but he had an awful lot of talent too. Yeah. And the way he gets his characters across town. I mean, getting a character across town is a real drag. It's worse than getting across town yourself, you know. But he always does it so lightly and humorously and briefly. Yeah. All his modulations, the way he melts one scene into the other, it's all seamless. He does the ordinary things better than anyone else.
So we've mentioned Clive James and Kingsley Amis and Christopher Hitchens, all very, very funny people who are gifted when it came to making people laugh. And your work has a lot of humor in it as well. Who's the funniest person in your life?
I think Hitchens, and if I may give one example, because he was always rude as well as funny. We were in a tiny restaurant in London that we liked going to. We called it the restaurant that's only big enough for one person. But there were only about 4 or 5 tables. And we were there waiting for our first wives to join us for dinner. And there were 2 upper-class guys causing a great deal of disruption by moving tables around. They were obviously expecting a lot of friends, and they wore wasted suits, long hair, but gentry class, and this is a very class-conscious time. And Christopher and I were sighing because we couldn't get on with our conversation because they were causing so much disruption and questioning the waiters and all that. And one of them came over to us and crouched down in front of us. And he was sort of pretty and pouty kind of guy. And both of them had the air of rather impoverished but upper-class people who patiently await the deaths of an elderly relative. And he came up and he crouched down and he pouted up through his fringe. And he'd obviously had great success with this look of his. He'd bent people to his will with it, and he said he was pretty obviously going to ask us to move tables. And he pouted up at us and he said, "You're going to hate me for this. No, we're going to hate us for this." And Christopher said, "We hate you already." And no one sort of hit it quite like Christopher.
The book is The Rub of Time. Martin Amis, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you.